In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California, visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her apartment was part of this really safe complex. It was gated. There were lots of lights and cameras, so anything that went bump in the night was just going to be, your noisy neighbors or something. On the last night of Nathan's stay, he was laying in his bed in the guest room, listening to the hum of the street lamp that was outside and the crickets and the passing by of cars, when he drifted off to sleep. At about 2 a.m., Nathan woke up, or so he thought. He couldn't move his body. He could only move his eyes, and even though he had never experienced sleep paralysis before, he instinctively understood this was probably that. He noticed the room was completely silent. There was no more crickets, no more hum of the light outside, no more traffic, just total silence. Then he started flashing his eyes around the room because he couldn't move his head or his body, and he started taking stock of the room. The bed he was in was positioned as far away from the door as he could, in the back right corner. From where he was laying, if he looked to his right, in that corner was this big armoire, and then, moving left from the armoire, as he scanned the room, he'd come to the door, which was on the opposite side of where his bed was. Then, if he kept scanning left, he would reach the foot of his bed, and just beyond the foot of his bed was a table and a chair. But because he was laying flat, he couldn't really look down and actually see the table and chair. So, with all of his strength, he managed to raise his head just enough that he had a line of sight to that section of his room, the only section he hadn't looked at yet. He sees the table and chair, and he sees in the corner this dark figure that's standing there looking at him. He's completely frozen with fear. His thought is, "There's an intruder in the house. How did they get in here? What are they doing in here?" He managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure, and he determined it was most likely a woman with a shawl covering her face. Before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground, out of view, and then Nathan's head fell back. Now he knows there's just some stranger in his room, and he can't lift his head up anymore. He's looking around with his eyes. He sees the armoire. He sees the door, but he can't see that table and chair. Then he hears the sound of someone slithering along the ground, out of view, and he can hear her breathing as she's getting closer and closer to the edge of the bed. He's laying there, terrified. He's so scared he can't even make a sound, and he's telling himself, "This has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up." He's laying there, and this woman, she stands up, and she leans out over his bed, and she looks at him. Her face is pale, and her eyes are sunk way back in her head. Then, she begins to slowly crawl on top of him. Nathan's sitting here, looking at this woman. He wants to close his eyes, but he can't, and he just feels his chest being pressed down. He can hear the sounds of the springs compressing all around him as this woman positions herself on his chest. Then, he finally manages to let out a scream, and suddenly, he's awake. The woman's gone, and he sits up looking around. There's nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the light and the crickets and the traffic outside, they all return. His mom comes running in the room and she's like, "Hey, are you okay? I heard screaming in here." He says, "Oh no, I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." His mom says, "Okay, all right. You need anything?" And he's like, "Nope." So she comes over, gives him a hug and a kiss, and goes back to bed. He would go downstairs, flip on a Disney movie, actually, Aladdin, and he would fall asleep with the Disney movie on and with the lights on. There was no more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and he headed back to his house, and he really couldn't shake the experience. He had never had sleep paralysis before, but it was just so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. And he's just thinking to himself, I can't believe there are people that put up with this on any sort of regular basis. But, after a couple of days and getting home and not experiencing any sleep paralysis, time went on and He just kind of forgot about it. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan is at this big family party in Chico, California, a big outdoor barbecue. All of his family's there, and at some point, his sister shows up. His sister was not supposed to be attending this party, so it was a great surprise. He hasn't seen her in a while, and he immediately pulls her aside to catch up with her. So, for the first hour of their conversation, they're just chatting about their lives and what they're up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to share his sleep paralysis experience with his sister. The reason he wanted to was because he knew that she knew that he was actually a skeptic, and so she would believe him if he's telling her this is what happened. She would believe that that's what he saw. So he starts by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment just a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis. And his sister immediately butts in, wait a minute, I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life. 2 weeks ago, at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room, and then I saw this woman. She was like standing on me, and I thought I was going to die. It was horrible. That's exactly what happened to me. I was laying in the guest room, and I couldn't move. Then I saw a woman in the corner, and she stood on my chest. They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories, and they discovered that they had almost the exact same experience. At the end of it, they wanted to have a rational explanation for how they both could just somehow have their only sleep paralysis experience in the same room, in roughly the same timeline, and experience the exact same events. They were trying to, come up with a rational explanation for that, but it was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them were really prepared to start discussing what else it could be, so they decided to just kind of laugh it off and say, man, that's pretty weird. And they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan would go back to his house, and he would tell his wife about this crazy coincidence he and his sister had had, and his wife would say, yeah, that's wild. But after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it, so he kind of just, pushed it out of his mental space and did forget about it. He moved on. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom would move out of that apartment building, and she would move into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove, California. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come spend a couple of nights with her, and Nathan said sure. In order to better understand what happens to Nathan over the course of his stay at his mother's new house, you need to understand a basic layout of her house. So, when you walk through her double doors, to your left is going to be a formal living room. In the center of the house is a hallway that shoots straight back to the kitchen, and then to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall are the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs to the second floor, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks back into the backyard, and immediately to your right, there is a single door, and that's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turned left, there'd be another door that's a mirror image of the master bedroom door, and this door is the guest room. That's where Nathan was going to stay. Then, to the left of the guest room was a hall that went to the front of the house, but that's irrelevant to the story. If you went inside the guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, so the same layout as the guest room in the apartment building, where the person laying in the bed, so Nathan, his feet would be closest to the door, and from Nathan's perspective in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new house guest room was a table that was, from his perspective, on the right-hand wall, centered on the wall, and on the table was a TV. So, those were the only things in the room. The first night Nathan was at this new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, laying on the bed, watching TV. The lights were off, and it was just the TV on. At some point, he dozed off. He wakes up a short time later, and he can't move. It's the same sensation he had when he was staying with his mom at her apartment, and he begins to panic, because the last time he felt this way, a strange veiled woman stood on his chest and made it feel like he was dying. And so, immediately, he's trying to move his body. He can't. So, using his eyes, He starts looking around the room, praying this woman is not in the room with him. He looks to the right, to that corner, which he can see. There's no one there. From this corner, he starts scanning across the room. He sees the TV. It's still on. He keeps scanning, and he sees the door, and it's open. And he's able to just barely make out the space at the foot of the bed. He can actually see to the corner, and this woman, she's not in here. So, initially, he feels incredibly relieved that she's not in the room with him. But then, he finds himself focusing on the open door into the dark hallway, and he's thinking to himself, "Please, please do not come walking through that door." And so, he stares at the open door, just hoping he breaks out of this sleep paralysis when he notices something about the TV. It's flickering. And so, he averts his gaze to the TV, and he realizes what he's looking at on TV does not look familiar. It looks like CCTV camera footage, like it looks like a security camera footage. And he realizes the footage he's looking at is the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognizes the way it was laid out. That's his mother's house. That's downstairs, and he's staring at the footage thinking, why is this footage playing on the TV? And I don't think there's a camera down there. When he notices, on the camera, the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame, and she looks up at the camera right as the camera turns off. And then the room is completely dark. There's no more ambient light in the room, the hallway is dark, and he's left paralyzed, knowing this woman is downstairs in the kitchen. And as he's laying there, he hears her start running through the house, and it sounds like an animal is barreling into things as she's running through the bottom floor, and she stops at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. And so, as he's laying there, he feels his heart racing, and he's staring at the open door. He knows she's going to fly up those stairs, and she's going to come through that door. And instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take 1 step, 2 steps, and as she's making her way up the stairs, he's just thinking, please break out of this trance. Stop this paralysis. Wake up. Wake up. And then he sees her head emerge, and she turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around and starts charging into the room on all fours, like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is scared for his life as this woman is charging towards him, and she stops dead in her tracks right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charging downstairs. And then it's silent. As soon as she was downstairs, Nathan could sit up, except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's apartment. When he sat up, he had the sensation of relief. He had woken up, he was asleep before, now he's awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he can sit up. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled, she's half asleep, and she's like, "Was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you?" Nathan's looking at her, and he can't even process what he's been through, whether that was real, whether it was a dream. And he's trying to find the words to describe to his mom the dream he had, but he just can't. He can't process what's happening, and he just says, "Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house." And so the two of them flip on every light upstairs. They're not even talking. They're at this point in survival mode. They turn on all the lights upstairs, and Nathan leads the way down. They're flicking on all the lights, and they manage to search the whole house, and there's no sign of a break-in. There's no one in their house. After the coast was clear, and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to kind of talk about what just happened. And so Nathan's like, "Okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. So, a few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was laying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room, and they were standing on me. It was terrifying, but it sounded an awful lot like sleep paralysis. But then, a couple months after that, I talked to my sister, and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house actually, she was in that room. And she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we've basically had the same experience. And tonight, I think I experienced the exact same thing, but it didn't feel like a bad dream this time. It felt real. It felt like something else. So I'm kind of freaking out here. And Nathan's mom says, "Okay, well, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, you know, I'm still trying to figure out why we're having these weird experiences with these dreams. Maybe it's the same thing that happened with your sister, but I don't know if I can be of much help. But you know, we'll figure this out together." Nathan never fully processed that night, and nothing ever quite felt the same for him after.